Barbara Campbell had been blind for years when she got a piece of her sight back. Not natural sight. Flashes, shapes, but enough to make out a doorway, the edge of a curb, the movement of a train. It came from a device implanted on her retina, a camera on a pair of glasses wired to an array of electrodes inside her eyes. For a while, the world came back in rough black and white outlines. Then, one day, standing on a subway platform in New York, it went dark. Not because her eyes had failed, because the device had. She said, "I was about to go down the stairs, and all of a sudden, I heard a little beep, beep, beep sound. Then, nothing." Her implant was never repaired, not because it couldn't be, but because the company that made it had moved on, and there was no longer anyone to call. Today, we're telling the story of second sight and the Argus II, the first bionic eye approved in the US. It's a story that sounds at first like a miracle, and then like a betrayal. But the truth sits in a more uncomfortable place than either, and that is exactly why it's worth telling. Welcome to this special edition of Tech Anatomy. The story starts in 1998 in Sylmar, a suburb north of Los Angeles that had quietly become the world capital of the implantable medical device. This was the territory of Alfred Mann, a serial entrepreneur who had already built companies around pacemakers and cochlear implants, the devices that restore a form of hearing to deaf people. And that is the key to the whole idea. A cochlear implant works by taking sound from a microphone and turning it into electrical pulses that stimulate the auditory nerve directly, bypassing the broken part of the ear. So the question almost asks itself. If you can restore hearing by sending electricity to a nerve, could you restore a form of sight by sending electricity to the retina? On the science side, two ophthalmologists had been chasing that exact question for years. The two scientists had shown, starting in the late 1980s, that if you electrically stimulate the retina of a blind person, they see a small spot of light. It is the building block of artificial vision. The scientists carried that work from Duke to Johns Hopkins to USC, and it became the scientific score of second sight. Now, there's a detail here that most people never hear. A lot of the underlying research was funded through the US Department of Energy across 5 national laboratories, the same institutions that work on nuclear weapons and advanced microelectronics. The technology to survive inside the salty, living environment of a human eye came in part from the labs that miniaturize electronics for the harshest conditions imaginable. The first product, Argus I, had just 16 electrodes. It was tested in 6 patients in the early 2000s. It was crude, it was experimental, and it worked well enough to justify the next step, Argus II. Before we go further, it's worth understanding what this device actually did, because the reality is both more limited, but also more impressive than the phrase bionic eye suggests. So start with the disease. The Argus II was built for people with end-stage retinitis pigmentosa, an inherited condition that slowly destroys the photoreceptors, the cells that catch the light. Over decades, it narrows vision to a tunnel, then to nothing. By the time someone qualified for the implant, they were down to bare light perception or complete blindness in both eyes. Here's the trick. In retinitis pigmentosa, the light-catching cells die. But the wiring behind them, the cells that carry signals to the brain, often survive. So, the Argus II didn't try to replace the eye. It tried to hijack the wiring that was still there. The system had 3 parts: a tiny camera mounted on a pair of glasses, a small video processor you wore on your belt, which turned the camera image into a simple pattern of signals, and an implant, an array of 60 electrodes, about 55 of them active, sitting on the surface of the retina. The processor sent the pattern wirelessly to the array. The array pulsed the surviving retinal cells, and those cells fired a signal down the optic nerve to the brain. The brain read it as a constellation of small flashes. Now, for the honest analogy, picture a stadium scoreboard made of 60 light bulbs next to a television with millions of pixels. On the scoreboard, you can spell a short word or show a block arrow. You cannot show a face. That is roughly the resolution we're talking about. So it's not natural vision, it's black and white, low resolution, and the results were real. In the 5-year data from the pivotal trial, published in Ophthalmology in 2016, 96% of patients were better at locating a bright square on a screen with the system on than off. 57% were better at judging which way something moved. About 60% could reliably walk toward a door. A smaller group, around a quarter, had measurable visual acuity, though at the very bottom of the scale. This was not reading a book, of course. It was telling a doorway from a wall, catching the motion of a car, finding the white sock on a dark floor. For someone in total darkness, that is not nothing. For some of them, it was everything. The regulators agreed. The Argus 2 received its European CE mark in 2011, and on February 14, 2013, the US Food and Drug Administration approved it. It's worth noting how it was approved, because it foreshadows the ending. It went through a special pathway called a humanitarian device exception, reserved for conditions affecting fewer than a few thousand people a year. The approval rested on data from just 30 patients. That pathway exists precisely because these markets are too small to justify the giant trials of a mass-market drug. The regulator was, in effect, acknowledging from day one that this was a very small world. None of that dampened the wonder. The National Eye Institute called it the first implanted device approved in the US to treat advanced retinitis pigmentosa. The press was less restrained. It called it the world's first artificial retina, the first bionic eye. Over the years that followed, more than 350 people around the world would receive the implant. For a moment, the future looked settled. Blindness, one of the oldest and most feared human conditions, had met an engineering answer. The only question seemed to be how fast the resolution would improve. Then the company ran out of one thing that an implant company can never run out of. Not money. That came through. It ran out of a future for the people carrying its device. In July 2019, patients received a letter. Second Sight was phasing out the Argus 2 to concentrate on a new project, a brain implant called Orion, that would skip the eyes entirely and stimulate the visual cortex directly. Production of the Argus would stop. That meant no more repairs, no more replacements, no more upgrades to the promised software. In March 2020, the company laid off about 84 of its 108 employees and announced it would wind down operations citing the pandemic. It later avoided outright bankruptcy through a financial deal, and in 2022, it merged with a new entity called Vivani Medical. In February 2022, IEEE Spectrum published the article that made the human cost impossible to ignore. It was called "Their Bionic Eyes Are Not Obsolete and Unsupported." Its finding was simple and devastating. More than 350 blind people had a discontinued device wired into their bodies, with no company meaningfully behind it. no software updates, no spare parts. The rehabilitation specialist who had taught them to use their new eyes had been let go. The specifics are hard to hear. The Argus II is not compatible with MRI scanners, and with the company unreachable, some patients could not safely get imaging they urgently needed. Ross Doerr, who needed an MRI to check for a possible brainstem tumor, put it plainly, "I still don't know if I have a brainstem tumor or not." His verdict on the whole experience became the headline of another article. It is fantastic technology and a lousy company. Terry Byland, the only person in the world to have received the implant in both eyes, said, "If something does go wrong with it, well, I'm screwed, because there's no way of getting it fixed." In the Netherlands, Jerome Perk, whose processor broke in late 2020, ended up crowdsourcing spare parts from other patients to repair his own device. "I had no vision, no Argus, and no support from Second Sight." These people were not left with nothing. They were left with something worse in a way, a dead device inside a living eye, and a decision no one had prepared them for. It would be easy here to reach for the obvious comparison and call this another Theranos. It would be wrong, and the difference is the whole point. Theranos was a technology that did not work, wrapped in fraud. Second Sight was almost the mirror image, a technology that generally worked, undone by a business that could not survive. The Argus II was CE marked, FDA-approved, published in peer-reviewed journals with a solid safety record. Roughly 350 people got a form of sight back. Nobody faked those results. There's no actual villain, and that makes it harder, not easier. So what actually broke? Well, economics. Retinitis pigmentosa affects somewhere around 1 in 4,000 people, and only the end-stage subset qualified, a very small fraction of an already small group. The device cost around $150,000 before surgery, and the operation is major and specialized. Now here is the detail that sharpens everything. An independent study found the Argus II was actually cost-effective from a health system point of view, with a cost per quality-adjusted life year of around 14,600 euros, well within the range payers accept. So this was not the case of a device that wasn't worth the money. The problem was the company, not the value. Over 24 years, more than $300 million went into Second Sight. Founder Robert Greenberg said it later, without drama. "I think the size of the market turned out to be smaller than we had thought. And with all the overhead of sales and regulatory people, it wasn't profitable." This is the orphan hardware problem. It is one of the quiet tragedies of medical innovation. A device can clear every scientific and regulatory bar, help everyone it touches, and still fail to sustain a company because the market is too small to carry the fixed costs. And with an implant, one of the fixed costs is forever, the obligation to support a device that lives inside a human for the rest of their life. That is the cost Second Sight could not carry, and it is one that fell on the patients. The easy lesson here is startups fail, be careful with your hype. But Second Sight asks something harder than that. When you put technology inside a human body, you are not selling a product. You are entering a relationship that outlives your business plan. The device does not disappear when the company does. It stays in the eye, in the skull, wired to a nervous system long after the last engineer has cleared out their desk. But this story is way more complicated because there is not one single person responsible for everything. Is it maybe the company that ran out of business? Is it the regulator that approved the system? Is it the market as a whole who was not ready for such innovation? It is still hard to answer, and this is one of the biggest problems in medtech today. That's it for today. Thank you so much for following this special episode. I will see you soon for another tech adventure in healthcare.